Well, good morning and good afternoon for some, and welcome to today's info session on the Cities and Counties for Fine and Fee Justice Bootcamp and Cohort 2. Brought to you by PolicyLink, the Fines and Fees Justice Center, and the San Francisco Financial Justice Project. My name is Monique Guevara, and I'm a senior associate at PolicyLink. Cities and Counties for Fine and Fee Justice is a national leadership network of localities committed to meaningful fine and fee reform that works better for people and for government. We are so excited to dive into the issue of fines and fees today and to share some very exciting ways that you all can join us in this movement. With that, I will walk us through today's agenda and we can get started. First, we are going to hear opening remarks from San Francisco Treasurer Jose Cisneros. Next, Joanna Weiss from the Fines and Fees Justice Center will provide broader context about the issue of fines and fees, both nationally and locally. We'll then turn to Ann Stoldryer at the San Francisco Financial Justice Project to lead an open conversation with government leaders and community members in St. Paul, Minnesota, about their fine and fee reform work, as well as their participation in the first Ccffj cohort. Anand Subramanian from PolicyLink will then provide an overview of how you all can get involved in this work, and we'll be sharing in more detail some really exciting ways that include our upcoming Ccffj Bootcamp, and later down the line, the start of our second cohort. We will close today's session with Q&A. However, you can also use the Q&A chat function throughout the session, and we will be able to respond to your questions there. So now I am going to turn to one of our partners at the San Francisco Financial Justice Project for opening remarks to share a bit about the work happening in San Francisco and the collective moment that is before all of us to advance local fine and fee reform. Over to you, Treasurer Jose Cisneros.
Thank you, Monique. And hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. And thanks for your interest in Cities and Counties for Fine and Fee Justice. I am pleased to join our partners at PolicyLink and the Fines and Fees Justice Center. And of course, our team here at the San Francisco Financial Justice Project to launch an exciting boot camp and the second cohort of the Cities and Counties for Fine and Fee Justice. As you heard, my name is Jose Cisneros, and I'm the treasurer of San Francisco. And our office launched the Financial Justice Project 4 years ago to assess and reform local fines and fees, especially after hearing from advocates, community organizations, and service providers that right here in our city, fines and fees were having an adverse and disproportionate impact on low-income residents and communities of color. And since we launched, the Financial Justice Project has worked with many of our own city and county departments, as well as the local court system, to propose and implement reforms to fines and fees and financial penalties. We've eliminated or adjusted dozens of fines and fees and lifted tens of millions of dollars in outstanding debt from these fees off of the records of tens of thousands of San Francisco residents. Let me just mention a few examples of what we've accomplished. We've eliminated all fees on phone calls from jails, as well as we've eliminated administrative fees charged to people exiting the criminal legal system. And we provided discounts or waivers on parking tickets and towing costs, to name a few. We did this by right-sizing or eliminating some fines and fees, by introducing the ability to pay discounts that are offered to low-income folks, and by creating alternatives, like instead of paying a cash fine or fee, instead allowing people to receive social service assistance to dismiss their actual fine or fee obligation, all in partnership with our fellow city departments and with our local community groups. We've learned that we can make a difference in the lives of folks who are living in San Francisco, while we also are implementing reforms that are actually affordable and doable for our local government. we can advance smart, effective government, as well as racial equity and economic justice all at the same time. And we're excited to see the momentum for fine and fee reform grow across the country. Over the past year, our organizations together have provided guidance to our first cohort of cities and counties for fine and fee justice, as they've forged partnerships between their local governments and community organizations. That cohort worked to understand the fine and fee pain points in their communities and to advocate for and implement reforms that have made a tangible impact on the residents where they live. And their successes are what you'll be hearing about today. Advancing meaningful reforms to fines and fees is both necessary and doable work. It's actually a win-win for local government and the people that live in our cities. The fact that you are here today means that you recognize that governments should not try to balance our books on the backs of the least fortunate people in our community. Cities and counties have a unique role in the movement for fine and fee justice. We're often one of the only parts of government that people can put a face to, and local governments, we all know, are the closest governments to the members of our community. This means that cities and counties are well situated to listen to and address the concerns of communities that are struggling under the burden of onerous fines and fees, and especially over this past year when local governments have been on the front lines in the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The financial burdens that our communities have faced have never been more apparent. And this only underscores the urgency of advancing tangible, sensible, and bold reforms. The reforms pursued here in San Francisco, as well as by the first cohort of cities and counties for fines and fees justice, have demonstrated that localities can hold people accountable without putting them in financial distress. Also, we found that fine and fee reforms do not automatically result in less revenue for the government. Our experience aligns with national research that shows adjusting fines to a person's income can make it easier and even more doable for people to be able to pay. We have all found that this work is rewarding. The reforms pursued by the first cohort were impactful, not just because they lifted a financial burden off of their own struggling residents, but because they had real, meaningful impacts on people's lives. And I would urge all of you moving forward to think of the impact of this work, not just in terms of the financial burdens that are lifted off of members of our struggling community, but in real human terms that can make a difference. So ultimately, from our team here in San Francisco and all our partners, we're really excited to see you here. We have an exciting day ahead of us where I hope you will learn more about the movement for fine and fee justice and see how you can get involved in the Cities and Counties for Fine and Fee Justice Network. Thanks a lot, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you so much for joining us, Treasurer Cisneros, and for helping us to begin today's very important conversation. So next up, I will turn it over to you, Joanna, from the Fines and Fees Justice Center.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Treasurer Cisneros, and thank you, Monique. I know that everyone who is on this webinar is familiar at some level to the issue of fines and fees. So I'm going to talk very quickly about the problem of fines and fees, make sure we are all aligned in what we're discussing, and then talk about some of the momentum that we're seeing around the country. Next slide. So we often talk about fines and fees together, but they're actually two very distinct things. Fines are monetary sanctions that are imposed as punishment and meant to deter people from violating the law. We see them very commonly in traffic tickets and parking tickets, but we also have fines that are associated with misdemeanors and felonies. Fees, however, are something else. Fees are essentially taxes that are imposed for every touch with the criminal legal system. They can be imposed for booking fees, prosecution fees, and even your fee for the attorney that you get if you are too poor to pay for one yourself. There can still be a fee attached to one. That money sometimes goes to support particular services within the criminal legal system, but often it goes to the general fund. It really operates just like a tax. Next slide. And the problem with fines and fees are what happens when people cannot afford to pay them. There are all sorts of adverse consequences that happen to people, including more fines and fees that remain unaffordable, and really an entrenchment in the criminal legal system and poverty that's inescapable. If you can't afford to pay your fines and fees, you are often stuck under court supervision for long periods of time, which comes with additional fines and fees, as well as other restrictions. You can have civil judgments imposed against you, which can impede your ability to get housing or even education. Your driver's license can be suspended. In 30 states, if you have fines and fees associated with felonies, you lose your voting rights. And in many places, there can be warrants and even incarceration for failure to pay your fines and fees. Next slide. These fines and fees are causing tremendous harm to communities, obviously because of the nature of policing and the over-policing of low-income communities and communities of color. Fines and fees extract wealth from our most vulnerable communities, and they lead to tensions between communities and law enforcement when we use our law enforcement as revenue generators rather than to protect public safety. As Treasurer Cisneros really explained, it compounds racial disparities in the criminal legal system. And because these are associated with warrants and incarceration, these literally criminalize poverty. Next slide. There was an amazing study done by Alabama Appleseed to actually understand the impacts on the community of people who owed fines and fees or family members who were paying off fines and fees for loved ones. They found that more than 8 in 10 respondents gave up basic necessities in order to pay their fines and fees. That means they gave up the ability to pay rent, to pay for food for themselves and their families, or access to medicine and healthcare. They also found that nearly half of the people who were surveyed had lost their driver's licenses for failure to pay fines and fees, and nearly half said that they had been jailed for failure to pay for their fines and fees. Next slide. It's not just bad for communities, it's actually also a bad source of revenue for government itself. Relying on fines and fees to balance our budgets leads to many bad outcomes. For one, it's an extremely inefficient source of revenue. The Brennan Center found that it costs more than 100 times as much to collect $1 of fines and fees revenue as it does to collect $1 of tax revenue. It's also an unstable source of income. And it's unsustainable because we literally need there to be more crime in order to balance our budgets. Based on some research that we did at the Fines and Fees Justice Center, we were able to document more than $27 billion of outstanding debt. And that is because we are trying to collect fines and fees from people least able to afford it. In that process, we are bloating the criminal legal system with people who can't escape on their basis of poverty. And we're also finding bad public safety outcomes. Research has found that higher fines and fees is associated with higher recidivism rates. It's also associated with the inability to clear violent crime and property crime cases from the books because we are using our public safety resources inappropriately. And as we've discussed, it is also exacerbating racial inequities, including adding to the racial wealth gap. Next slide. We think of this often as a state problem, but in fact, it is very much a local problem as well. Governing Magazine found that there were 600 cities across the United States that were operating much like Ferguson and generating more than 10% of their revenue from fines and fees. It is a problem in cities and counties across the country. Next slide. Thankfully, and we will go into all of this in far more detail in our boot camp, there are many, many things that cities and counties can do to advance fines and fees justice and reform in their communities. The first is to stop suspending people's driver's licenses for unpaid traffic tickets or a missed traffic court hearing. We can put people before profits by lowering the high fees that are associated with being incarcerated. We can also end the other fees that we see with every touch in the criminal legal system. Many of them are within local government's control and can be addressed at the local level. And finally, local government can reform fines, either that exceed people's ability to pay and are imposing an undue hardship on people and their families, or eliminating fines that simply serve no compelling public policy purpose at all. Next slide. And again, these are some of the examples that we will talk about in much greater depth in the boot camp, but just to give you a few examples of the kinds of reforms we are seeing advancing around the country to address these very buckets of reforms, which will be the basis of our agenda in the Bootcamp. We're seeing a tremendous amount of movement around ending driver's license suspensions that are based on debt at the state level, but we're also seeing exciting reforms happening at the local level. In Durham County, prosecutors have worked with the courts to eliminate debt associated with uncollectible old traffic fines and have restored tens of thousands of driver's licenses to the people of Durham. Dallas, which was one of the participants in the first cohort, has ended driver's license suspensions and hold on driver's licenses that are related to unpaid debt. In addition, several prosecutors around the country, including in Shelby County, which was again one of the members of the first cohort, prosecutors have stopped charging people for driving on a suspended license when it is related to debt and not public safety. Next slide. We're also seeing a tremendous movement, a little bit at the state level, but much more at the local level, with ending the fees that are imposed on people who are incarcerated and their families. New York City became the first city 3 years ago to end the cost of phone calls for people who are incarcerated. As Treasurer Cisneros mentioned, San Francisco quickly followed suit. Two members of cohort 1, Dallas and Philadelphia, have moved incredible reforms to lower or eliminate costs of phone calls for people who are incarcerated, as well as markups on commissary accounts. Next slide. We are also seeing, and this has really been a movement that has been driven at the local level, to eliminate the fees that I mentioned that are imposed in the criminal legal system. Buffalo, New York, repealed 13 vehicle and traffic fees that were adding $100 to every single traffic ticket that was imposed in the city of Buffalo. Los Angeles County has eliminated discretionary criminal administrative fees, which include probation fees, electronic monitoring fees, and cost of counsel, and they have waived all of the debt that is related to those fees. Ramsey County, Minnesota has eliminated probation fees and other fees that are associated with the criminal legal system, and also has waived the debt that had accumulated associated with those fees. Next slide. We're also seeing fee elimination in the juvenile justice system. We've seen this at the local level. Two great examples are Dane County, Wisconsin, and Sacramento, California, which have repealed fees in the criminal legal system. Sacramento, California has also, both have also waived the debt that was outstanding relating to those fees, lifting many, many families of debt burdens that they were never going to be able to meet. Next slide. And finally, we're seeing real momentum in making sure that any fines that are imposed are equitable. Treasurer Cisneros talked about some of the movement in San Francisco, and you'll hear some of them in the next panel. We've also seen New York City move on this issue by decriminalizing possession of open containers and public urination, which are fines that are often imposed on people who are homeless and have no ability to pay. And by moving them out of the criminal legal system, not only did it eliminate any court cost fees that were associated with those violations, it also let them add some new ways of handling those crimes by offering alternative sanctions to fines. Instead of a fine, you can actually watch a 1-hour video to understand why those violations can harm your community, and that will resolve those cases and get them out of the criminal legal system and stop people from being trapped in never-ending cycles of punishment and poverty. Again, all of these are areas that we will move into in much greater detail in our boot camp, as both the problems and the solutions and the tools to address them. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Anne and to the team from St. Paul.
Thank you so much, Joanna. I'm really excited about this conversation we're about to have with our friends from St. Paul. With us, and St. Paul participated in our first cohort of cities and counties for fine and fee justice. I'm really happy that today we are joined by Mayor Melvin Carter with the city of St. Paul, by Munir Karcher-Ramos, who is the director of the Office of Financial Empowerment, by Kevin Reese, who is the co-founder and co-CEO of Until We Are All Free, and by Anna Odegaard, who is the director of the Minnesota Asset Building Coalition. Thank you so much, all of you from St. Paul, for being here with us today. Mayor Carter, great to see you. I'd love to start with you first. You have led so many reforms in the city of St. Paul, and you've really elevated the issue of fine and fee justice. Can you start us out by just talking about why is this an important issue to you in St. Paul, and what are some of the wins you've advanced locally?
Well, thank you so much. I have to disclose, we're also joined by Amila Carter, who had a positive COVID case in her child care class. And so she's home for the week. Her test was negative. So she has gets a sick week without even being sick. So she's having a blast. So don't worry about her, worry about me is the long story short.
Additional panelists are welcome, so.
Indeed. Oh, she'll probably weigh in. Look, this is something that's become really passionate, that we've all become really passionate about. It's become a real centerpiece of our work. You know, I came into office, obviously, before the pandemic began, and we kind of built this notion of like what it would look like, what it would mean to build a city that works for all of us. Before the pandemic began, our sort of starting place was library late fines and the realization of all the ways in which late fines in public libraries just don't meet up with our values. The library has forever been the global symbol of free access to information. And when I got elected mayor, we had 50,000 of our residents who had their lending privileges revoked for as little as $10 in late fees, dating back 10 years. And we realized how wrong that is, how nonsensical that is. And community members and frontline library staff came together to say, hey, this doesn't make any sense. We need to change this. And within the first quarter of that shift in policy, we saw a double-digit increase in library use in all of our lowest income communities. And so that was before the pandemic. Thankfully it was, because we sort of got to have a citywide conversation about the fact that these fines don't really do what we think they do. We think bail keeps us safer for some reason. We think late fines make people bring their book back, when in all of our own personal lives, we know that they just make people stay away from the library. And so, that was something that was a sort of a low impact, probably a test case that we ran, that we realized this is really important. It can help families live with dignity in our community. It can help, help people make just ends meet in our community. And it can make the services that we provide as a city be so much bigger, so much more impactful. And so between that, some of the driver's license work that you were talking about earlier, in the pandemic, we realized, wait a minute, we have all these cars in our impound lot. And, every now and then somebody loses their car because they didn't want to pay $600 to get it back. Those aren't Mercedes Benzes coming from our, highest income neighborhoods that end up stuck in impound forever. Those are the cars from folks who desperately need them to get to work, who desperately need them to go. And it's just so clear, as I was just even hearing the conversation about, how much it costs to call home from jail, how much it costs to just get the things that you need to survive. And it's part of this conversation about the high cost of poverty and all the ways in which we levy these different taxes and different fines and different fees on top of low income residents in ways that are us being part of the problem. And so, sort of from a first do no harm perspective, I think we're pretty enthralled with the opportunity. So one, mine kind of our community for ideas like eliminating late fines. We're excited about the opportunity to sort of get the city out of the way and to stop using our lowest income communities to gather money through fines and fees to help us pay for stuff that, if it needs to be paid for, it's probably far more honestly paid for just through a tax levy or through, something along those lines, as opposed to just putting another burden, as opposed to us as policy leaders, policymakers, just putting another burden on top of our lowest income residents.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Mayor. Kevin, I'd love to turn to you next. Kevin, you led a community engagement process to really understand in St. Paul what fines and fees are really hitting communities the hardest. I'd love to hear from you. Is there anything about the impact of fines and fees that you'd like to share with folks that you think they don't understand? And could you talk about your role as a community member on the team and how that helped you advocate for reforms?
Yes, for sure. I kind of want to piggyback off what Mayor Carter was just saying. From some of the listening sessions that we had, what folks kept coming to was they was being criminalized because they were poor, right? Poverty is being criminalized, where they can have an action, a human emotion, or a human mistake, or whatever that looks like as a human. And the consequence on the back of it is to say, give me money. And they saying, I actually made that decision because I don't have money. Money is one of the things that I don't have. So now the city is asking me for something that I don't have. So guess what happens? Now I'm in this perpetuating cycle of owing the city money. It's hard when you owe family money, friends money. You don't want to owe nobody money in the streets. So picture owing the city money. On the back end of owing the city money is prison, is jail, is them actually being able to come and take physical custody of your body for being poor. A lot of the crimes were actually motivated by poverty, drug addiction, trauma, generational poverty. And the best the system will come up with will say, well, give us more money. And folks are saying, well, I barely have a place to stay because I have this criminal record now. So I have, barriers to even have housing. There's a whole entire list of things that I just can't do anymore. There's a whole entire list of places I just can't go anymore. And one of the things that was really alarming, and it's crazy that this still exists in 2021, is the license, right? When folks owe child support or any fines or something, for the city or the state to be able to revoke your license, how do these folks supposed to get to work and pay this money back? I don't know who created this law, or I need to do some research. I'm glad I'm talking, and I need to go look into that because it's just been such a part of my lifetime. I don't know a lifetime where Black people, it wasn't something that my uncles talked about and my big cousins talked about, something was really familiar in my community, with folks having their license revoked because they owed the city for this or for that. It just became so normal. This has been my whole entire lifetime, that this has been a real thing. And if we would go back to the inception of such a law, who would create such a law? Would say, okay, these folks owe us money, and now we're going to revoke their license so they don't have access to work, to the workforce, and we still want our money. And if they don't pay us our money, we're going to compound the fines and fees. And if they don't pay those, then we'll just send them to jail. And guess what? When they get out of jail, we'll have the same bill waiting on them. So this is just like this perpetuating cycle. So that was one of the things that I heard from community. Also, community felt this way, but folks felt really marginalized and they didn't even know where to begin to fight. So when we had listening sessions, there was this natural urge for folks to come together and not only just be a part of this conversation, but to be a part of this conversation and beyond. And also community was really fed up with folks coming and get their stories, hear their pain, hear their trauma. And then on the back end of it, it's just more conversations, more this. But in the middle of all of these conversations, these folks still is struggling with owing fines and fees and having to pay these fees. And if they don't, they suffer consequences. So there was this huge urge for community to want to be involved and be engaged. And we have a huge population of our community who is involved, who is engaged. But guess what? There's still so many folks in our community who feel this way. This is on their hearts. This is on their spirits. It's impacting them every day. And they don't even know where to begin to change it. They feel that powerless to it. My particular role in this, when we did these listening sessions, I was still Director of Criminal Justice at Voices for Racial Justice. So my role in this is someone who was on the staff there who has, criminal justice experience. I spent 14 years, 8 months inside a Minnesota correctional facility. So I'm really familiar with the feeling of being held against your will by the state. And all of these folks who was coming through this and the folks that we talked to also had this experience of being held by the state against their will. And it was a tragedy when some of the time they was held because they couldn't pay, which feels like ransom. Like it's actually a law. It's like kidnapping and holding these folks for ransom is what it is. If these folks in community took any of our bodies and said, I got your body now, and if your family want to talk to you in prison, they're going to have to pay triple the cost. If you want to get your body out to fight, you got to pay bail. If you want to be able to have soap and all of the necessities that you need to take care of yourself while you're incarcerated, it's going to cost you triple the cost. They're holding bodies for ransom. That's what it feels like. Now, we have pretty laws, we got pretty language that say other stuff, but in essence, it's kidnapping and being held for ransom. That's what it feels like to your body when you are taken from your home and held, and the thing that can get you free is money that you do not have. So my role in that work was just someone who experienced it myself, knows what it feels like to owe fines and fees. I owe some fines and fees as well too. And it's really scary because you're already fighting against so many other things. And now you got to say, okay, now I got to pay the man money. You owe so many people money, and now you got to pay the system money as well too. So it was a real transformational time doing that work. It was important to me that when we had those listening sessions that we wasn't just in there, just transactional, tell us your trauma, give us your pain, and we'll do this. So I'm glad that we're having this follow-up conversation. And I know for me, for my own self and my credibility in community, I'm really looking forward to what changes from these, because those are one of the things that I heard from folks. Please don't let this be another time when the city or the state or organization or group is coming in to hear these horrific stories about the worst days of my life, and don't give me $100 gift card and tell me, oh, okay, we'll try to change it. So I'm really, really excited that the mayor is on this call. I'm really excited that everyone's here that's on this call, because on the other side of that, there's a community that's waiting to see change. They don't got no money to pay these people.
Right. Kevin, thank you so much for that and laying that out so clearly. Munir, I'd love to turn to you next. You coordinated the St. Paul team from the mayor's office, and just would love to hear from you. Why did you all decide to apply and be a part of Cities and Counties for Fine and Fee Justice? And is there anything else you want to highlight or mention about the reforms you all have advanced?
Yeah, thank you, Anne. Really appreciate it. Great to be here with you, Mayor Kevin and Anna from Team St. Paul. I think, we really got into it as, Mayor spelled out. We started with some elimination of library fines, and then shifted into a number of COVID fine and fee reforms. And I think for us, it was really about how do we get into community with other jurisdictions, as well as, Policy Link, Financial Justice Center, and the Fine and Fee Justice Center, to basically accelerate the work that we were already doing, and really find the way to have the greatest insights to, imagine, different possibilities. So I think it's sort of grounded and rooted in there. And from there, and sort of the what Kevin was mentioning was the different sessions, that were, we call them prioritization sessions. And there were 3 different priorities that emerged. One was on driver's license suspensions and reforms there. And I know Anna will speak more to that, so I won't say much more. But also on towing and impound, waivers, and then exploring sanctions connected to child support. We're able to move on those first 2 and are still exploring, the third piece on child support. I would say for folks who are interested, to jump into this space, it's really figuring out how you work across, department boundaries. So I think about how our Office of Financial Empowerment work with our city attorney's office, work with our finance and budget team, work with our intergovernment relations team, the police, public works, and really was sort of a real coordinated internal team. And then we had our, community partners with Kevin and Anna and a number of other folks, who kept us accountable, kept us honest, but also, kept us real grounded. Just knowing that it's a full institution thing and not just, a single department, to really advance the work and really look at those intersections to reimagine what's possible.
Thanks so much, Munir. Anna, I'd love to turn to you next. So you worked really closely with the St. Paul team to end the practice of suspending driver's licenses for unpaid fines and fees in Minnesota at the state level. First off, Anna, I'd love to hear, why your coalition decided to take this on, and how did you work with the St. Paul teams, and what were really the benefits of this kind of local statewide partnership?
Thank you, Anne. And I just so appreciate the invitation to participate today and talk a little bit about our work and our partnership with St. Paul. So thank you for that invitation. So I direct the Minnesota Asset Building Coalition, which is a coalition of nonprofit organizations across the state. Sometimes people ask me, why would an asset building coalition be involved in criminal justice reform? For some folks, it doesn't seem like a direct connection. And so I talk a little bit to people who ask me that question about the fact that the way that fines and fees work in our criminal justice system, they end up stripping assets from exactly the communities where we as a coalition are working to create asset building opportunities to eliminate barriers to economic mobility. And so when we really recognize that connection between fines and fees and stripping assets, not just from individuals who are involved in the justice system, but as I think Kevin talked about, the mayor talked about, their families, their friends, their communities end up coming together to try to pay those fines and fees. And so it strips assets from entire communities. So that's why we are involved in this criminal justice reform work. And I'll say when we got involved first about 5 years ago, I didn't know a lot about criminal justice fines and fees. So what I did is I just invited folks around a table. And one of the first people that was at that table, Jess McConaughey, who's the deputy city prosecutor for St. Paul, who was also part of the Cities and Counties for Fines and Fees Justice Project, was at the table, which was one of the luckiest things that could have happened because she was incredibly knowledgeable and just really passionate about ensuring more integrity in the justice system that she was working for. Is still working for. And so the folks around the table tried to pinpoint some of the points of escalation in this fines and fees system. And one of the things that became apparent really quickly was that, and Kevin has talked about this really eloquently and really passionately, the driver's license suspension for unpaid fines and fees is this point of escalation, both of justice system involvement and of justice-based debt. So people end up having these fees that get stacked on top of each other because most people can't support themselves, take care of their families without driving, at least occasionally. Driving leads to more tickets, and so that those fines and fees stack up. So that's why we wanted to work on this. I know we're short of time, so I'm going to kind of jump ahead to what actually happened this past year. But just really want to underscore that the work we did with the city of St. Paul and being involved in the Ccffj project just gave a boost to our campaign at exactly the time that I think we really needed it. We've been working on this bill for a few years, but it made a real difference. And I want to talk about that specifically, but then just so people know, the legislation that got passed this past year, it ends driver's license suspensions for the state of Minnesota for failure to pay any traffic related fine or fee, for failure to appear in court on a petty misdemeanor traffic. So not for maybe a more severe traffic violation like reckless driving, but anything like speeding, rolling through a stop sign, any equipment violations, things like that. Failing to appear on those will no longer trigger a license suspension. And then the third thing, in Minnesota, I know some other states do this too. If I lose my license, if my license is suspended, but maybe I continue driving at least occasionally, like I said, to meet the basic needs of my family or to keep my job, then I get a driving after suspension ticket. In Minnesota, when I pay that ticket, which is a conviction, there's actually a tacked on suspension period. So what people end up having is this suspension that sort of stretches out to the horizon, because as trying to work to get the money to pay off their fines and fees, they might get pulled over for driving after suspension. Now their suspension is 90 more days. It's 120 more days. So our bill also eliminated that tacked on suspension period for a conviction on driving after suspension. So that's what the legislation did. We're really excited about it. The Department of Public Safety estimates they'll issue about 144,000 fewer suspensions per year based on this legislation. It doesn't solve all the suspension problems. Kevin and Munir mentioned a couple of them. It doesn't address suspensions for non-payment of child support and some other issues, but it does take care of it in those areas. So I want to talk about how working with Ccffj really helped this. And I would say First of all, just the technical assistance that was available through the project. So hearing about what other areas were doing. So for instance, Treasurer Cisneros talked about them discovering through their experience in California that right-sizing fines and fees or ending driver's license suspensions for a non-payment doesn't actually reduce revenue. It actually increases revenue when you right-size those fines and fees. That came up on one of our calls. I asked, what's the citation? Where can I find that? They directed me to where I could find that in some documents from the California experience. I talked to Minnesota legislators about that. I talked to our lieutenant governor about it. I put it on the handout that I was putting in everybody's hands. So just that real concrete interaction with folks who are doing similar work and learning from their experience so that I can then take their experience to educate folks here. Super helpful. And then secondly, around just that technical assistance, the work that Kevin and Brett and their team did at Voices for Racial Justice with the listening sessions was so helpful for us. I can talk about numbers to legislators all day long, and the numbers matter, right? But hearing the personal stories, and I didn't get to be in the listening sessions, but Kevin debriefed with me afterwards and really shared a lot of what happened in those sessions. And just to hear the passionate personal experience of what it means to have fines and fees stacked up to the point where you can't see your way out. It really inspired me, but I think probably more important, Kevin and his colleague, Brett Grant, also after that listening session, joined up, they partnered up with me, and we met with legislators together, and they shared with legislators what they had heard in these sessions. They testified, Brett testified in one of our legislative hearings on the bill, so that legislators could hear, what are we hearing from community about the impact of driver's license suspensions? And you've all just heard Kevin talk about it, and so I think you can imagine how effective it is with policymakers to hear the personal side of what those driver's license suspensions mean. So those things were really helpful. I just want to maybe just say two other quick things. It also, working with this project, just expanded our team in some ways that were really important. We'd already been working with the State Bar Association, the County Attorneys Association, and those were really important supporters and allies. But through working with this team, just to give some real concrete examples, the city of St. Paul has a racial equity legislative work group. They got involved. I will wrap it up. They got involved, they endorsed the bill, they really made it more visible for the St. Paul legislators who became some of our best champions. I will just want to do a quick shout out to Mayor Carter. I had reached out to Munir at a real critical point in the session, asking for the support of the city. Mayor Carter drafted an incredible letter that he sent to legislative leadership, supporting the bill, letting our legislators know why the city was behind it. And I just think that it boosted the issue up high on the priority list for our leaders. So just being able to expand our team that way was incredibly important. So thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Munir, for that. And Kevin, of course, the work you and Brett did with me was just so important. So I'll wrap it up. I know we're short of time, but it really boosted the campaign at a time that we needed that boost to get past the finish line. Thank you.
Wonderful, Anna. And thank you so much. And I just really want to thank everyone so much from St. Paul. I think you guys just, gave a great, vivid example of, how your team worked, the reforms you were able to advance together, and what it was like to be part of this network and what folks got out of it. And, I just want to say we've learned so much from you all in St. Paul, and just thank you so much. I'd love to turn it over to my colleague Anand from PolicyLink.
Thank you so much, Anne. Hi, everyone. My name is Anand Subramanian. I'm a managing director at PolicyLink. Just really want to appreciate the St. Paul panel. We asked these experts and leaders to come in and share some wisdom in about 5 minutes, and they were able to do that remarkably well and have so much more to say. And just want to thank them for being willing to come to drop in and share their experiences. So first we heard from Treasurer Cisneros in San Francisco about their model. We heard from Joanna from FFJC about the national landscape around this issue. And then finally from St. Paul about what they were doing locally and what their experience was like working with cities and counties for fine and fee justice, this partnership between these three organizations in the first cohort. So it's my privilege to tell you now how you all can get involved and what's coming up next. Next slide. So first, we want to tell you about this amazing opportunity that we are hosting for the first time in March of 2022. We'll be hosting a Ccffj Bootcamp. This bootcamp is really a convening where we'll be doing a number of things, including going really broad and training folks on a specific model to address fines and fees in your localities. This model is the roadmap to equitable fine and fee reform that I'll be talking about a little bit more shortly. We'll also be going into deep dives on specific reform issues that Joanna talked about, and I'll remind folks about on the next couple of slides. But these are important issues that are gaining momentum, so the time is right, but they also can make a bold impact in your localities. You'll be able to engage with fellow policymakers, with advocates, officials, experts from across the country. You'll be able to receive actionable tools, some of the tools that have been popping up in the chat, and new resources as well that will help you understand the issue and really help you understand the landscape of what's happened already. Are there best practices that exist? Are there examples of legislations and laws that can be replicated across the country? And then importantly, you'll learn about some application criteria for the second Ccffj cohort that I'll talk about shortly. But on this slide, maybe the two most important things, who is this bootcamp for? So we're really wanting to target teams of two, ideally, so two representatives from locations. One can be a government staffer, official, department official or elected. And then the other team member could also represent that, but could be a community member, another expert from that community. So we really are trying to get about two representatives from cities and counties across the country. We'd like to get about 50 cities and counties represented in the room. And travel and accommodations will be provided for those two representatives per location. Next slide. So we spoke a little bit about one of the big goals of the bootcamp will be to train attendees on the roadmap to equitable fine and fee reform. I'm going to ask Monique, if you haven't already, to drop a link to the roadmap in the chat. But the roadmap was a guide that we developed for the first cohort of Ccffj, and it really is a path for cities and counties to take to understand the issue of fines and fees in your location, to make the right connections with the right folks within community, to prioritize issues, as we heard from Kevin and the other St. Paul team members about, and to figure out to what extent fines and fees are impacting the bottom line in your communities. And so I'm not going to go through this slide in detail in the interest of time, but the roadmap has all of this information, and you kind of see the through line from building your team. Kevin, Munir and Anna talked a little bit about the types of departments that they engaged throughout the process, and it was comprehensive. Ensuring the community representation is present on the team, and they're at the table and actually leading the priorities. Really assessing the problem in your communities. Using that information to develop the specific reforms you want to target in your first year and your second year. And then finally, of course, enacting and implementing reform with community perspectives and engagement, robust engagement that's not tokenizing throughout the whole process. So at the bootcamp, we'll be talking a lot more about this. We'll be leading attendees through what this all means, how to do it well. You'll hear from folks who went through it. And with that, I'll go to the next slide. So I'm going to fly through these next slides. Joanna talked about all of these issues in her presentation, but we'll be doing deep dives on specific issues, and this is just an example of them. We may have room for other issues, but we talked about administrative fees in the criminal legal system. Next slide. Driver's license suspensions. Of course, we heard from Anna just a second ago about what they did in Minnesota. We'll hear from others, and also what you can do in your communities. Next slide. High cost of incarceration. So this is a cutting edge issue that a lot of localities are working on. A number of places in our first cohort, including Philadelphia, address this as part of their work with the cohort. Next slide. And then finally, the issue of fines. Joanna talked about at the beginning, the difference between fines and fees. What can we really do about fines? Where are they appropriate? When they are appropriate, how do we ensure that folks can actually pay them? And so we'll really be diving deep on this issue as well. Next slide. And so one of the main advantages of attending the bootcamp is actually a prerequisite to join the second cohort of this of cities and counties for Fine and Fee Justice. So the bootcamp is open to all. You don't have to be interested in CCFFJ, in joining CCFFJ to attend the bootcamp. We really want folks who are interested in the issue of fines and fees, who are already working on it in their communities, or who want to start to spark the momentum needed to address this issue in your communities. The bootcamp itself is open to all. But if you are interested in diving much deeper over the course of 2 years, July 2022 to August 2023, there is an opportunity to join the second cohort of cities and counties for Fine and Fee Justice. In the first cohort, we had 10 teams. In the second, we're narrowing it to 5 so we can offer more comprehensive, broader, and deeper support for those teams. And so here are some of the benefits and supports that you'll receive if you do decide to join CCFFJ. But the important takeaway for the purposes of this webinar is that at the bootcamp, we'll go really deep into the opportunity to join CCFFJ, what these benefits and supports really mean. You'll hear from other teams that were involved in the first cohort. And so if you would like to be considered potentially for the second cohort for CCFFJ, we are making it a prerequisite to attend the bootcamp. So there is no penalty for attending the bootcamp and not applying for the cohort. But if you are interested in the cohort or think you might be, we strongly recommend attending the bootcamp. Next slide. So here are some next steps, and then we'll turn to questions and answers for our remaining time. And if you have questions about these next steps, please do ask them in the Q&A box, and we'll get to them. So next week, we'll be sending to everyone who registered for this webinar and a number of other folks that are on our mailing lists across our organizations, a link to fill out an interest form for the bootcamp. The interest form is pretty short. It'll take about 5 minutes to fill out. But we really want to understand who's interested in joining, and we want to make sure we have the right mix of folks, representatives from all across the country, cities and counties, et cetera. And so if you do apply, if you are interested, we ask that you try to coordinate with other folks within your cities or counties, and maybe create a team of 2 to apply together. In about a month, the interest forms will be due. So January 16th, mid-January, we're going to ask that folks submit the interest forms by then. At the end of the month, we'll confirm your registration. And we really are going to make every effort to ensure that every locality that applies gets in. If there are more than 2 people from locations that are interested, we will try to accommodate you, but we will preference more locations just so we can spread the message more widely and really start to catalyze the momentum very broadly. And then, of course, there'll be some logistical back and forth between January and March, but March 3rd and 4th in Phoenix, Arizona, we will hold the bootcamp. The first day will be a deep dive, or rather the training on the roadmap. The second day will be the deep dive on issue areas and more information about the CCFFJ cohort. You can see here some of the deadlines associated with the cohort. You'll hear a lot more about cohort deadlines after the bootcamp. But again, if you think you might be interested in joining the CCFFJ cohort, please do fill out the interest form for the bootcamp and attend the bootcamp. Next slide. So we have about 6 minutes or so for questions, and let's drop the slide deck. Thank you, Jen, for that. And we're going to turn to a few questions here. So can the team of 2, the first question I'm seeing is, can the team of 2 be 2 government folks from 2 different cities within the same state? That's a great question. We're really focused on specific local jurisdictions. So if there are multiple jurisdictions within the same state that want to attend, we'll treat those as separate jurisdictions. We would welcome 4 total people, 2 representatives for each locality to attend the bootcamp. For example, in the first cohort, we had Allegheny County in Pennsylvania and the city and county of Philadelphia as part of our cohort. We think this is a local issue that, of course, ties to statewide policy. And so we're trying to leverage that. We would love to be able to think about leveraging multiple jurisdictions from the same state to do what St. Paul did and really do some work at the state level. One of our other teams, Seattle and King County, they were working at the state level too, at the state of Washington. We would welcome city and county hybrid teams. So if your city sits within a county and you'd like for a representative of each, the city and the county to come together, we would welcome that. If you would like 2 representatives from each, the city and the county, we'll think about that, but we are prioritizing breadth as well. Another question I'm seeing. So I know that Anna and Munir are on, and Kevin are still on from St. Paul. I'm going to ask you, maybe a representative from the St. Paul team, if you could answer these questions in the chat, and maybe just make sure you're responding to everyone. I think there are a couple of questions that are specific to St. Paul. So there's a question about what the bill number was related to driver's license suspensions, and then what's happening with the reforming of child support, fines and fees, and also what's happening with the implementation, I think, of the loss of driver's licenses. So if you could answer some of those questions in the chat, I'd really appreciate that. If we do have time to circle back to you and come off mute and maybe go deeper, we will definitely do that as well. So we have a question about what kind of governmental partner is best to attend. That's a really good question. What we're really hoping for ideally is if you're interested in the Ccffj cohort, Munir was a team coordinator for the St. Paul team, for example, and Munir is a director of the Office of Financial Empowerment in the city of St. Paul. And so which sits under the mayor's, which sits within the mayor's office. And so who we're really looking for are folks who sit within a government agency or department that have some connection to the issue of fines and fees. That could be within the office of the mayor or a city manager, or someone who has the authority to really make a huge difference on this issue. It could be someone who's more related to finance or budgeting, someone who is on the revenue side, who really wants to make a difference, but is approaching it from that angle. Potentially an office of equity. So someone from within departments that have some connection to the issue of fines and fees would be ideal. And then, so at least one person that kind of wears that type of hat. But we're open and flexible, certainly, and there may be examples that I didn't name. The second person could be another person like that. That would be ideal. It could be a community representative who you've been working with, if you're a city or county government staffer, who may be a part of the team. It could be someone from the courts, or a prosecutor or a public defender, for example. So those are the types of folks that I think make the most sense to attend. We'll spell this out in some information we'll be publishing next week, and you'll receive that with the email that contains the interest form. Let me see if there are other questions here. I'm going to turn to Joanna and Ann to answer this question, and maybe some of our St. Paul representatives as well. Have any of the panelists or participants focused deeper on the impact of fines on our unhoused community?
Yeah.
Ann, why don't you start?
Yeah, sure. I'll start. That's a great question. We know that fines can hit folks who are unhoused particularly hard. In San Francisco, we found that folks, could get fines for sleeping on a park bench, etc. Then the fine would increase through late fees, and then the record of the fine was creating barriers for people to get jobs or to get into an apartment. So, again, that doesn't make sense for what we're trying to achieve in government. And it certainly doesn't work for our unhoused folks in our community. So what we did is, if someone receives one of those citations, they're able to clear it and the late fines, everything, through receiving social services. We think if someone connects with a community organization and starts getting help, that's one of the first steps they can take to help resolve their homelessness. So that's something we've done in San Francisco, and I know there's other reforms that are similar percolating throughout the country. So thank you for that question.
And as I mentioned in my brief remarks, there's been some movement on this as well in New York City to find alternative ways of handling tickets that are typically assessed against people who are unhoused. We've also been working with partners around the country to really draw that connection and show how often fines are in fact imposed on people who are unhoused. There was a great study that just came out of North Carolina from the Duke Justice Lab that shows actually just the percentage of fines and fees that are being assessed against people who are unhoused. We've also learned about this from the Alabama Appleseed study and are replicating that research right now in New Mexico and Nevada, because I think that we've found in many, many places, low-level fines are often assessed against people who are unhoused who don't have any ability to pay. And there are probably better ways of handling this than added enforcement against people who can't possibly pay.
So we are at time. I want to invite, if folks have to drop off, we totally understand. If folks can stay on for another 5 minutes or so, maybe we can get to a few more questions. Jen, is that okay if we keep the webinar going for a bit? I'm going to assume the answer is yes. Okay, great. Thank you. So we have a question about, maybe I'll combine these questions. There's one question about what are the common barriers to reform? And then there's another question that says, that asks, how can you get local government on board with these changes? Are there any tips to get the right leadership on board? I'm going to kind of combine those questions and turn it to anyone who'd like to answer.
I would say one of the common barriers for sure is power. Right, the folks who've created this system, we're talking about money. So this is an industry. It's not in their self-interest to give up this industry. They have banked their whole careers off of this industry. Folks just went to school. Folks is like, this is their career. So it's going to be hard. The biggest barrier is actually getting people to do things that's actively making their job obsolete and making their industry obsolete. And what was the question about the government officials? What can they do?
How do you persuade government officials to support this issue?
We have to make it, somewhere where it's in alignment with their self-interest, where there's a future for them in this work as well, too, where they can see that it may be making this part of their work obsolete, but if they are into human services and human justice, then their work must evolve, just like all of our work needs to evolve. So I think we sway them by giving them a path forward for their work to evolve and for us to continue to honor living in a democratic society where we have elected officials, but for these elected officials to get the permission to say, hey, I know this is made what you learned and this is what you walked into, but it does not mean it has to stay this way. And change does not mean the end. It could be the beginning of something much newer, much grander for all of us.
That's right, Kevin. And I think sometimes, folks in government don't realize what a lose-lose some of the ways we implement fines and fees are. And I think by, talking honestly about the harms of these, what happens to folks when they cannot pay. And then also, looking at bringing folks who are directly impacted by fines and fees. And then also, looking at the revenue side, because again, a lot of times if these things are charged to very low income folks with very low incomes, the payment rates aren't that high, the collection rates aren't that good. So they're really what we call high pain, low gain. And a lot of times there's really a better way and a more equitable way to achieve whatever it is we're trying to achieve in government.
One last thing, Ann, when we bring directly impacted folks to the table, don't bring them to the end of the table, right? Treat them as equal partners in this conversation, that their experience and what they have to share is just as valid as any elected official, any mayor, any of us who's on here, whose lobbyists is just as valuable as anyone else is at the table, because they are community members just like the rest of us. So please put respect on their name when you invite them to the table.
Yeah, thank you for that, Kevin.
Great. I think with that, we are 5 minutes over and we're going to close. We have tracked all the questions and we will we are going to send out a web page that has a lot of frequently asked questions and responses to them. If any of these questions, we'll certainly add the questions that are about the bootcamp to that. And we can also respond directly to some of the questions. Please fill out the evaluation that pops up when you close your window, and you can ask your question again in the evaluation. We'll get back to you for sure with answers. But I want to thank Monique for hosting, and Joanna for presenting, the amazing St. Paul team. And we really encourage you to please take a hard look at this opportunity to join the bootcamp. We're really excited about it, and we think it's going to be an amazing opportunity to learn more about this issue and really make a difference in your locations. So look out for that email next week, and thank you so much for joining us.